This lesson, we are going to continue to learn about sectionalism and events that would increase sectionalism. Sectionalism, once again, is loyalty to the interests of one's own region or section of the country rather than to the country as a whole. In the previous lesson, we learned that the economies, the cultures, and the political interests of the North and South became more and more different as the country evolved. Sectionalism, the biggest issue that divided the country in the years prior to the Civil War, was slavery. We learned that this sectionalism arose in part and basically because the geography and a few other practices resulted in a very different North and South. The South, being based primarily on agriculture with plantation system, relied highly upon slaves, while the North, which, because of the geography and natural resources, became a region of trading and manufacturing. And if there were agricultural things going on in the North, like in the breadbasket, they were grown on small farms where the farmers more or less pool their goods and they're sold by a third party. Perhaps most important was the laws emancipating slaves in the North. The political differences resulted in the North being primarily Federalist, while the South was Democratic Republican. Any event concerning slavery usually increased sectionalism. Slave revolts were no exception. The northern free states saw slavery as a major problem that needed solved or eliminated. And two events concerning slave rebellions would increase sectionalism. One was the Nat Turner Rebellion, and two was the Denmark-Vesey Plot. The Nat Turner Rebellion being a slave revolt in Virginia where 55 to 60 whites and 200 African Americans were killed, and the Denmark-Vesey Plot being a planned uprising where a free Methodist leader was accused of planning a 1,000-slave riot. He and 36 co-conspirators were hung. The final thing we learned about was the Louisiana Purchase and new states that would be formed from it. And it was mainly political, but the South worried about whether the new states would be free or slave. And this was because of control of Congress. The North had already taken control of the House of Representatives, but the Senate was balanced. The new states that would be formed from the Louisiana Purchase would affect this greatly. And if they were to go in favor of the North and free, the South would lose control of both the House and the Senate, and the North would possibly be able to outlaw slavery, leaving a large population of African Americans that the South would not be able to control. I forgot to show you this newspaper clipping of the Nat Turner Rebellion, which shows the chronology of the Nat Turner Rebellion, which increased sectionalism. It looks that a family was attacked, then the slave rebellion spread, then eventually there's resistance, and eventually a lot of death. But this event would increase sectionalism. Another consequence of the Denmark-Vesey Plot and the Nat Turner Rebellion was a development and increase in the prohibitions of the slave codes, which we've already learned about. But just as in the Stono Rebellion, the Nat Turner Rebellion and the Denmark-Vesey Plot resulted in the slave codes being strengthened even more. The lesson today concerns mainly the abolitionist movement and its effect on Southern society and its origin and how it spread. The abolitionist movement, this would lead to more tensions between the North and South, which increased sectionalism. Now, initially, the North, the abolitionist movement existed, but popular opinion was most of the Northerners didn't care. There were some that were strongly against slavery, but initially they were uneducated about slavery. And it's like, hey, I'm not really a fan of this abolitionist thing, but I really don't know about it. He's like, yeah, me either, who cares? But anti-slavery literature would begin to educate Northerners on the evils of slavery, and it would cause the abolitionist movement to grow in the North. And one of these anti-slavery newspapers was published in Boston, Massachusetts, and it was called The Liberator. Liberty meaning to free from slavery. Now, this was published in Boston, Massachusetts by a man named William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist, and Boston had become a center of abolitionists in America. Now, the important thing is, these abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, would increase the feelings of Northerners towards the abolition of slavery. William Lloyd Garrison, will draw a quick drawing of him when he was older so we can remember Mr. Garrison, who fought using words against slavery by publishing this newspaper. Another book, even though that would further increase the abolitionist movement, was Uncle Tom's Cabin, although this was not written until the 1850s, but it does belong in abolitionist literature. So the abolitionist movement, the move to outlaw slavery, increased sectionalism between the North and South, and it also increased the amount of abolitionists in the North who were now going to be educated upon the evils of slavery. In some case, some of the things were misconceptions, but we'll get into that. But still, it was a powerful piece of published material for furthering the abolitionist movement. Now, the abolitionist movement grew, but not in South Carolina. And the reason it did not grow in South Carolina, one, it was too well ingrained in Southern methodology or whatever, two, that slaves were just a part of life. But two was what happened at the post office. And what happens is, there would be shipments of this abolitionist material to the South, except it never made it into the hands of Southern readers, because the postmasters would do the following. the South Carolina postmasters, which would be the people that work at the post office, in fact, like the managers of the post office, would be like, "Postmaster, the liberators are here." He goes, "Oh, bring me down. I know exactly what to do with those liberators." "You going to send them out?" "Oh, we're going to send them out all right. Here they go. Into the trash. In fact, give me a match. Let's light this on fire." And the Southern postmasters said, "No one is going to read this inflammatory nonsense." Inflammatory means riot inciting, etc., things like that. So these abolitionist newspapers did not get into the hands of the Southern people because postmasters merely threw them away and said, "Good riddance." So, the abolitionist movement. The goal of the abolitionist movement was to outlaw slavery in the U.S. It grew in the North because of anti-slavery materials such as the Liberator. However, it made South Carolina slave owners more determined to hold on to their peculiar institution, what they refer to slavery as. At first, the abolitionist movement was not popular among most Northerners. However, the Liberator, published by William Lloyd Garrison, would increase its popularity, as well as other anti-slavery newspapers. The postmasters across South Carolina removed from the mail what they considered inflammatory materials, including anti-slavery newspapers, a form of censorship, as it's called, in the South. I might have spelled that wrong. But they could not keep abolitionists from reaching a larger and larger Northern audience who did no such action as removing the mail. As we learned in a previous lesson, Southerners responded to the abolitionist criticism by claiming that slavery was a positive good because slaves were better cared for throughout their lives, unlike Northern wage slaves. Before we cover more abolitionist movement things, you may be curious about the means by which slaves escaped from the South to the North and where that takes part in our learning. Well, we only learn a little bit, but what was that means of escape called? Yes, it was called the Underground Railroad. Well, the Underground Railroad was not very successful in South Carolina because South Carolina was too far from the border of the free states, which eventually would lead into Canada, which would be the only way slaves could actually be free. Because even if they settled in the free states, they were still technically in the United States, technically someone else's property, and technically, if you had them in your possession, you were in possession of stolen property. So, the Underground Railroad was not successful because South Carolina was too far from the free state border. And to reemphasize, the Underground Railroad didn't run much in South Carolina, even though it was not a railroad at all, but a series of safe houses, because South Carolina was too far from the safety of the free states. Here's a picture of the Underground Railroad. In the next lesson I will talk more about it, but you can see the paths by which the slaves would escape on this network. The last part of the lesson concerns two abolitionist sisters from Charleston who were going quite against the Southern way of life by publicly attacking slavery, and also they fought for women's rights as well, there was a lot to be gained in that department. These two abolitionist sisters from Charleston were called Sarah and Angelina Grimke. The story of Sarah and Angelina Grimke is as follows. They were born to a wealthy slaveholding family, and gradually they turned against slavery because of seeing slaves whipped and other things. And when they were young women, they asked for their inheritance, not in slaves or they asked for their inheritance, and it wasn't in money or land, but they wanted it in slaves. And when they were young women, they immediately emancipated all of the slaves that they received as inheritance. Now, from this, they would become verbal opponents of the abolitionist movement and write certain papers. William Lloyd Garrison actually published one of their papers criticizing slavery in his Liberator in Boston. Now, we're going to learn more about Sarah and Angelina Grimke. However, after the Denmark-Vesey plot was uncovered in 1822, abolitionists like the Grimkes were given a choice by the South Carolina authorities. And after the Denmark-Vesey plot, the South Carolina authorities said, either be quiet or leave. Now, as a whole, the abolitionist movement, it only strengthened the Southern resolve against the abolition of slavery. So abolitionists only made South Carolinians more determined to hold on to what they deemed their peculiar institution. And of course, in criticism to the northern, or in response to the northern criticisms that were being spread in the anti-slavery literature, the South responded with their argument that slaves are better cared for than northern factory workers because of the economic interest Southerners have in them. And they said, slavery is a, let me put on my Southern bell, slavery is a positive good, better than the treatment of those northern wage slaves. So, the South referred to the immigrants and others that worked in the factory, a dismal job, as you learned last year, as wage slaves. And in many ways they were, which we will learn a lot of the companies in the North, including the coal mines where my ancestors worked, they paid the workers not in dollars, but in company store money. So it was a means of control, and that happened in South Carolina in the textile mills as well. Once again, I name my Southern slave-owning lady Mrs. Headright, because it was the Headright system that led to the establishment of large plantations. Let's see a real picture of Sarah and Angelina Grimke, or at least a period drawing. So here are the Grimke sisters from South Carolina. We drew a generic drawing and we tried to draw the little bonnets, but I could probably do better. Now, they were strongly disliked by most of Southern society because they were attacking slavery, which was the entire basis of the economy, society, and culture of the South. Eventually, they went to the North because they were not welcome in the South, as we'll learn in future lessons. Here's another picture. I don't know which one's more realistic, but their voice against slavery was a strong one, and that's why William Lloyd Garrison published it, because they had first-hand accounts of life under slavery. And here were people that owned slaves that were turning against it because they saw it as such an evil thing. This concludes the lesson for today. In the next lesson, we will review most of these topics and learn more about the Grimke sisters, as well as learn more about the source of the Southern worry of political control that they feared would outlaw slavery. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.